Well, welcome to a very special Christmas Dramatic Drams tasting pack. We thought what better time of year to choose the absolute quintessential Scotch whiskies, go back to basics and get back to classic. The range we have here is the Diageo Classic Malts. It's the 6, minus the Lagavulin, most classic malts of Scotland chosen by Diageo from the distilleries they owned that were often just used in blending, and they decided to release as single malts, and we've chosen the special edition versions of each. The classic malts are selected based on their optimum age, and it varies across the different distilleries, some 16, some down to 10, depending on when it's at their maximum, and the way that Diageo thought that this single malt expression of what they've been using in their products was best represented. We've gone one step further, and each of the classic malts on the table is the distiller's edition of that classic malt, which means they've taken the great original version of the malt and they've finished it in a special cask in order to give it a bit of extra flavour, a bit of extra depth, and really emphasise or complement some of those distillery flavours. Without further ado, we'll kick off with Glenkinchie. Glenkinchie is a lowlands distillery, which is rarely seen these days widely available. Most are, of course, Speyside or Highland, if you're looking at the Scotland region. Very, very floral and light malt, and the way that it's usually matured and bottled emphasises that floral and cereal notes to that new make spirit. What they've done for the Distiller's Edition is finish it in Amontillado sherry, casks from the Jerez region in Spain, the capital of Spanish sherry, just to give it a bit more red fruit depth. And on the nose, that's certainly true. The floral is there, but the currant and plum of the sherry really comes through. On the palate, the floral is complemented by apples and pears, maybe a little bit of light citrus, but not much at all. And as opposed to the sort of standard edition of the classic malt that is Glenkinchie, that sherry adds a really, really nice plum pudding kind of element, perfect for Christmas time. Reasonably short finish, but more of those sherry notes on the finish, as opposed to those, the floral is overtaken a little bit as the whiskey starts to finish. Now, I should point out that we've got a lovely whiskey waiter in front of us, which is a antique, in fact, from when the classic malts were first introduced. You can see in front the labels of each one, obviously not representing the Distiller's Edition, so they have the age of the classic expression on them. But this was presented at clubs or at restaurants when Diageo wanted to represent their full range of these classic malts. We're missing the Lagavulin today because our tasting packs have 5 drams, but we believe for a Christmas theme, the flavours that they've chosen to represent in these 5 are the best for our pack. But the reason I mention it is because the waiters or the inventors of the whiskey waiter didn't have our particular order in mind, and in my opinion, and I'm sure in a lot of people's opinion, they've misordered it. So we are going to jump to Cragganmore as our second today. Cragganmore is not a very well-known whiskey as a single malt, apart from the classic expression. It's used a lot in Diageo blends, in their ranges where they want to create a lovely, fresh base spirit to then blend with other whiskies to create other products. The single malt is a very nice example of, it's not peated, but it's just got that wisp of smoke. It's a little bit dry, but it's still very cereal oriented, very grain malt oriented. But in the Distiller's Edition, I'm just smelling on the nose now, they've finished it in port casks, which adds a real spicy dried fruit element that's not there on the classic. So it's more nutty. It's got a lovely hint of like almond. Quite sweet though, so sugary almond. And they drink beautifully. All of these, in fact, they're under 46, They range from 40 up to 45.8 for our final. But it means they're very sessionable, quaffable drams. On the palate of the Cragganmore, definitely nuttier and more of that preserved fruit, classic date, maybe a bit of sort of the preserved plum. And the port is adding all of that spice, maybe a bit of sort of the nutmeg. Again, Christmassy dram. Our number 3 is Oban. Very similar sort of backstory to the Cragganmore. Not your typical, you don't see a lot of single malts or expressions from the Oban distillery. And the classic expression is a very nice sessionable dram and very light and floral. However, the Distillers Edition, which we believe adds a beautiful element to it, is finished in Fino sherry cask. And Fino on the spectrum of sherries is at the dry and a fine, Fino meaning fine, end of the sherry. So it just emphasises those slight tannins, some lovely burnt sugar. Stone fruits are more present on this one than on the first. And on the palate, that absolutely carries through. Again, very, very drinkable. Relatively short finish, but bigger hit on the front palate. And then it starts to dissipate quite quickly, but very, very great upfront flavour. Yeah, that Fino adds a huge new dimension to the classic take on this malt. And you don't see many Fino sherry finished whiskies, or even certainly full maturation. Fino's less available, and also because of that drier quality, if you've got whiskey in wood and it's quite tannic to begin with, or you're creating a tannic malt, then Fino can dry it out a bit too much. Where you've got a nice, light, but intense, sweet and fruity whiskey to start with, Fino can counterbalance that beautifully. Now, all of the Distillers editions that we have were distilled around the 2000 mark. Our next one is distilled the oldest, in 1998. It's the Dalwhinnie. Dalwhinnie is Scotland's highest distillery, nestled in the Grampians. It has a very different, even though Scotland is a cold place for a lot of the year, where Dalwhinnie is situated will see snow a lot of the year. Its warehouses, it's all matured up there as well, so it's got a different maturation profile to the others, meaning that when Diageo decided to bottle classic malts, it was appropriate to bottle the Dalwhinnie at a higher, or at an older bottling. So while most of them sit between your 10 and 12-year-old level, actually Oban's up to 14, Dalwhinnie sits at 16 years old standard, or 15, years old standard, and this one is into the 16-year mark. On the nose, it's intriguing. It's got a beautiful, it's got those peaches, preserved peaches, those that have been sweetened in the preservation process. Figs. It's a little bit herbaceous as well though, maybe some thyme, which we all need more of. And on the palate, this one drinks hotter. So even though the alcohol content isn't through the roof, it's lesser alcohol content than we often have in our packs, in fact, but it's just that really, really nice mouthfeel, and possibly because of the age, but also the finish is longer, hence why it's towards the end of the order. We definitely recommend that you would have this one after having these if you're doing it as a flight. On the palate, yeah, just really, there's a lot of depth to the flavour of the grain, the malt. It's a little bit nutty, but not too much. And it's got that, I should say this is finished, the special point about this one, it's finished in Oloroso casks. It adds a little bit of that dry tannic as well, but it adds a bit of a complex, almost a sooty, somewhat waxy, but mainly sooty taste in a good way. Certainly a longer finish than our other malts so far. Finally, Talisker. Well-known name. Talisker 10 is one of the absolute classics. You'd struggle to find a bar that doesn't have a bottle of Talisker 10. The Distillers Edition is a higher ABV, which we fully support. This is a old edition of the Distillers Edition, so there's been a few iterations since this. This was distilled in 2000. I think we're up to about a 2005 distillation version by now. They all go for the same profile. It's the standard, brilliant, not overly heavily peated malt, but certainly peated single malt. But this one is finished in Amoroso casks, which for sherry drinkers out there will know it's a sweetened Oloroso. So you've got that drier, dirtier Oloroso, which can complement sweet, lighter whiskies brilliantly, but also because it's not Oloroso, it's Amoroso, adds that sweetness that complements what is not a heavily fruity whiskey to begin with, because Talisker's on that drier, more seaside sort of style. Talisker, of course, being from the Isle of Skye. It's got a bit of that. It's not so much the lanolin peat or the mineral peat, but it's a very smoky, briny style. Spray of the sea type. On the nose, that's there, but there's a really beautiful sweet sherry behind it. The burnt sugar off a creme brulee, so caramel and vanilla as well. Not a lot of the red fruit, more your fireside, end of the night sipping whiskey. Oh, but drinks fantastically on for the palate. Higher ABV again, creates better mouthfeel, more viscosity. Sooty peat. So for the peat lovers out there, the people who only ever buy heavily ppm'd, this is probably not your dram, but it'll be a step up from the Talisker 10 in terms of depth and in fact that intensity of peat. For those who don't necessarily know they like peat yet, or have had a bit of a foray into it but aren't quite converted, this is a great place to start because it's there, but ultimately this is just a lovely, because of the Amoroso finish, sweetened whiskey. Absolute compliment to any type of seafood, certainly. But we can have it with Christmas turkey. Well, a finish on that goes and goes. As we have to do now, that's the end of the tasting notes. We hope you enjoy the Christmas pack. We think that the use of Diageo classic malts will appeal to everyone. Whiskey connoisseur, because it's a little bit different to the actual classic malt being Distillers Editions. Also to the total new to whiskey imbiber who hasn't tried anything. This is a great range. You'll get your classic Diageo malts in there, classic profile of some Scottish whiskies from lowlands to Speyside to islands, but also with that little bit of a sweetened element, adding a bit of complexity and a bit more to talk about. Until next time, Sláinte and Merry Christmas.